Linda Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, 1954. The Brown vs. Board of Education case was a Supreme Court case from the beginning of the Civil Rights era when African American children were being turned down from attending white schools simply because of their race. This is segregation, the action or state of setting someone or something apart from other people or things. This case all began with Linda Brown. Linda Brown was a 9-year-old African-American girl who had to get on a train at the railroad station with her sister in order to get to her all-black elementary school, even though there was an all-white school only 7 blocks away from her house. But, because of her skin color, she had to hop on that train every day just to make it to school. While Linda Brown's story is one of heartbreak, her story isn't the only one. Many African Americans faced these hardships due to the fact that they lived nowhere near their schools. In 1896, the Supreme Court passed Plessy v. Ferguson. This case uses the terms separate but equal. This was a legal doctrine in the United States constitutional law justifying that racial segregation did not necessarily violate the 14th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States, which guaranteed equal protection under the law to all people. The minute that this court case began to infringe on constitutional rights, the Supreme Court had to step in.
Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, Briggs v. Elliott, Davis v. Board of Education of Prince Edward County, Virginia, Bowling v. Shutt, Gebhardt v. Ethel. These are the names of 5 cases brought to the Supreme Court, and while the names may be different, the causes are the same. These 5 cases fought for the constitutional right to desegregate schools. When these cases were originally fought in district courts, judges did see merit in the cause being fought for, but they ultimately sided with the school boards. When taken to the Supreme, the 5 cases were merged into one case, which we now know as Brown v. the Board of Education. To say that this decision was an easy one to make is definitely an understatement. The Supreme Court definitely had the work cut out for them. In June of 1953, the Supreme Court decided to hear the case and confer on making a decision. When meeting to discuss the case, the justices of the Supreme Court realized that they were greatly divided over the ruling of the case. Most wished to reverse the decision of Plessy v. Ferguson, announced segregation unconstitutional, but they were unable to come to an agreement. Due to the inability to come to a decision, in December of 1953, the justices decided to rehear the case again with hope to gain a new perspective. However, during those months in between June and December, Chief Justice Fred Vinson died, and Governor Earl Warren of California took his place. With this shift in command, real decisions were finally able to be made. After the rehearing in December, Chief Justice Warren was able to do something that his predecessor was unable to do before: bring the Supreme Court to an agreement. On May 14, 1954, Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the opinion of the court. He states that we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate education facilities are inherently unequal. They won, and it was all because of little Linda Brown.
Though the Supreme Court decision for Brown v. Board of Education was literally one for the history books, the battle did not end at the decision of the trial. No, in fact, that decision was the beginning of a very long battle. While everyone in the entire nation was affected by the Supreme Court's decision, the southernmost states were greatly affected. While segregation did exist in the North, it was very informal. However, those in the South were not happy. Riots and protests broke out all over the South, and racism flourished. But as time went on, desegregated schools became a new normal. The decade following the decision of Brown v. Board shed light on teachers and faculty with racist tendencies, and they were fired. Schools became a common meeting ground for all people to be able to learn. Over the next few years, laws were passed making schools more accessible for students of color. The Bilingual Acts of 1968 and 1974 mandated that schools offer bilingual programs to all students for whom English is not their first language. In addition to this, the Equal Opportunities Act of 1974 was passed to prohibit discrimination against faculty, staff, and students, including racial segregation of students, and required school districts to take action to overcome barriers to students' equal participation. And just as time moved on, old ways began to die. Today, 90% of all students are enrolled in public education, and these public schools serve more students of color than they do white students.
It has been 24,227 days since the passing of Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, and much has changed over that time. Schools have been desegregated and people of color have many more educational opportunities. However, racism still exists within our education system, though it may not be as blatant as it was in 1954. According to the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights in 2014, African Americans made up 48% of preschool children receiving more than one out-of-school suspension. However, African American students only made up 18% of the population actually enrolled in a preschool. Also, an African American student is 3 times as likely to get suspended or expelled from their preschool rather than their Caucasian counterpart. In a K-12 classroom in 2014, less than half of the students enrolled were non-white students, and yet they represented almost 2/3 of the students involved with school-related arrests. The Department of Education also disclosed that only 19% of students with disabilities were African American, and yet they made up 39% of students with disabilities who are subjected to mechanical restraints. In a study conducted by John Valent and Daniel A. Newark, entitled The Politics of Achievement Gaps, U.S. Public Opinion on Race-Based and Wealth-Based Differences in Test Scores, African American students tended to test lower on standardized tests, but a survey was conducted and 44% of Americans responded that the discrimination against blacks or injustices in society does not explain the difference in test scores between white and African American students. But our racism does not stop in primary and secondary education. A study shows that an African American student is more likely to take on more debt in order to complete an undergraduate degree. All in all, the Supreme Court case, Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka, was a landmark case in the fight for true equality between white people and people of color in our education system. And while we have come a long way, we still have a long way to go.